Hello and welcome back to Parley, my on-the-spot responses to the prompts you submit. This one is from Just Rusty. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about the Bazaar, the game The Bazaar, and the untapped potential in sideboarding. I've been absolutely fascinated, Just Rusty begins, with the Bazaar recently, now that it's free to play. It has a lot of balance problems, which may or may not be solved, but some of the ideas being thrown around are fascinating. I think the most interesting thing about it is the way it's using the sideboard. The in-game keyword for it is stash in the Bazaar. Items in this game come in small, medium, and large sizes, which take up 1, 2, and 3 slots, respectively. And as you progress through a run, you gain more space on your board to place items, like more slots, I guess. You also have access to the stash to place items which currently don't fit in your board or you don't want to run. The stash has 10 slots, which could be used to hold items. The typical way we think of a sideboard in a competitive game is that it lets you build contingencies for a deck which counters yours and allows interesting counterplay if the format goes longer than best of one. The Bazaar doesn't allow this kind of counterplay as you face a ghost of a different player's run at the end of each in-game day, and you don't know what build they're going to be using. You do get to know the class of each player as they're coming in and what are the meta builds those classes are likely to use, but current wisdom is that it's very hard to get an edge through sideboarding against specific classes when late game runs are so dependent on scaling and synergy, and each class has multiple archetypes, and there are events and enchantments that give classes items from outside their archetypes. What then is the point of the stash, sideboarding? I'm glad you asked. Before we get into it, I already have a few comments. I love the topic of sideboarding. This is really interesting. I want to talk a little bit about sideboarding before riffing on sideboarding in some interesting ways. This parlay's text is very long, so I'm kind of just going to give Just Rusty the floor for like the whole middle because I have to. It's long enough that that's required to fit this in a 40-minute-ish time block. But also, you said it very well. I do want to set up some thoughts about sideboarding before we do that, and then you have a thing to discuss after we do that. So I kind of want to do the normal sideboard thing on this side of it. And then I already have a really interesting comment, I think, about the 1, 2, and 3 slots. So sideboarding in a lot of games, my experiences with Magic the Gathering primarily, is really overlooked, in my opinion. I guess that is sort of where I'm coming from with this section. I think a lot of people might think of sideboarding as just like not relevant to them or interesting or whatever. And I wanted to say that it like really could be improving one's ability to have fun with, let's say, Magic in a lot of ways. And that Magic and a lot of games like it are maybe way better games than they seem like they are, with just some very small changes or emphasizing playing certain ways rather than other ways. The way I usually play Magic in my spare time is with my folks, my friends, uh, my not really my family, but my mom sometimes. And we mostly play tiny leaders or popper, or we'll like draft. I'm working on a cube, we would be drafting that. It will be a one-on-one drafting cube because that's the amount of players that I usually have. But yeah, usually it's stuff like that. And we pretty much always try very hard anyway to play best of 3 games. We pretty much always allow the person who we perceive to be worse off to go first, or like pick whether they play or draw first the first game to give them the slight edge, such that if they can win that game and then just win one more, then maybe good. And it's sort of on the enfranchised player, often me, just because of my experience playing, to win, maybe 2 games after that first one. So the point is, we play like a lot of sideboarded games, right? That emphasizes playing the person who we think is slightly disfavored to win gets an advantage the first game, which makes it very likely we go to 3 games, which I think is often a good experience. Additionally, I personally think that a lot of the time sideboarding seems like less of a big deal than it is because people don't think of it that way. You have a first game, you can scout it out, and then you have games 2 and 3, both of which you can be sideboarded. If we simplify for a moment and assume that you sideboarded effectively, that means that more of the time your deck is played with its sideboard than not by a significant amount. I think that's important. It's normally true that you play more sideboard games than not if you play in a tournament and you play best of three. But I think people don't think of that as being as big of a deal as it is. Additionally, a lot of games that are played in like a 60 card constructed format in tournaments, well, the deck is built to be like good stuffy, basically. And so it's kind of easy and not that interesting a lot of the time, in my opinion, to put sideboard cards in. It is much more interesting to sideboard a deck that is synergy focused and tiny leaders, where you have a commander, a single creature you know you're going to have outside the game, and then a singleton deck. Well, this can be a very interesting format for sideboarding. With a 50 card deck, not a 60 card deck, and a 10 card sideboard, your sideboard can swap out a lot of the volume in your deck. And the cards in your main deck can only be one-ofs. Sideboard cards often want to be one-ofs, so that again gives some advantage to the sideboard. It's a format that can very heavily play up sideboard cards, but at the same time, it's not that easy to put sideboard cards in because you're encouraged to synergize with your commander. All of this is to say, it's a format that we have found to be very interesting for sideboarding. And it's interesting for sideboarding both because you get to respond to your opponent. The core thing that is fun about Magic, I would argue, is that you get a lot of ways to futz with your opponent. That is the thing. Doing your own fiddly thing on your side of the board and playing solitaire is not playing a competitive game. No offense, it's okay if you enjoy that. It's just a different game from the thing I'm referring to. And instead, it is when you get to interact with your opponent, and it gives you a lot of opportunities to do that. In particular, you get opportunities to make a transformative sideboard, not to sideboard to counter your opponent, but to sideboard maybe to counter your opponent indirectly, but to transform your deck into something else that is maybe a better matchup. Basically, just swap out your deck, kind of. Again, if you have a 50 card deck, 20-ish lands, 30-ish non-lands, and your sideboard is 10 cards, you can remove 1/3 of your non-land cards. You can more or less swap out your deck, your strategy, I guess I might say. Certainly your way of winning, maybe. So it can be really interesting that way. There are a lot of strategies that make it really easy to find your sideboard cards. So even though you're playing this like pile of synergy pieces with your commander, it can be like a library looking for your sideboard pieces. I play a deck based with Grist the Hunger Tide as my commander, and Grist's mechanic is that she has this ability where you take the top card of your library, put it in your graveyard, and if it's an insect, then you repeat the effect, which is that you make a 1/1 creature. So you can make a lot of little bugs if you build pretty much your entire deck insects. And I have done that because there are a weirdly large number of creatures in Magic that have the insect creature type that are basically intended to be sideboard cards. Like they're hate cards. They hard counter artifacts or blue cards or whatever it may be. So constantly exploding your deck into your graveyard, and you need all of your cards to be insects anyway, makes it really easy to find your sideboard cards, which means they have a big impact and they kind of don't interrupt the theme. It just so happens that there have been a lot of those over Magic's history. It's a really interesting deck. It's a deck that is very like synergy heavy and kind of laser focused, but still manages to be really interactive. If you like those kind of solitary decks, that is possible. Basically, in this section, I just wanted to start by saying I think that sideboarding, no notes, normal sideboarding in a game like Magic is already massively slept on as like a fun, interesting thing. That's not even to get into all the shenanigans with limited sideboarding. In Magic, when you play with cards you just opened on the spot, limited, you don't bring a deck you made previously, constructed, you're allowed to sideboard any cards that you opened as part of the process, and it is not uncommon for players playing sealed, where you open a whole bunch of cards and then build a deck from your choice of the stuff you opened, to literally just build multiple decks and sideboard out literally their entire deck and put a different pile of cards in front of their opponent and say, okay, game two, let's try something else. That is surprisingly viable, let's say. I've had lots of good wins off of that. And there have even been formats in history where there was a card that was like a really gimmicky sideboard strategy that you could get some wins off of. A memorable one is called Lost in the Woods. This card says it's an enchantment, so it just stays on the battlefield. You play it, it just stays in play forever until your opponent destroys it, maybe. And it says when your opponent attacks you, you flip the top card of your library. If it's a basic forest, if it's a basic green land that you can have as many of as you want in your deck, the creature doesn't get to attack you, basically. So what you can do is if your opponent has a very creature-focused strategy and they seem really greedy and they don't seem to have a way to remove enchantments, you game 2, you calm down, it's gonna be fine, you're probably gonna win. Sideboard out your entire deck. Sideboard in a deck that is like 45 forests and 1 copy of Lost in the Woods. Draw your hand. Probably didn't get Lost in the Woods. It's fine. Mulligan aggressively to find your Lost in the Woods. And then play lands for 5 turns and hope you survive. Play your Lost in the Woods and you're immortal. Your opponent decks themselves. Hopefully they'll just surrender once they understand what's going on. I've won a game of Magic that way. I don't know, but that's not a good example in that that's such good game design. It's not. That's a pile of jank, and it's basically just gambling for your wins. I did it as a gimmick, and it was a delightful gimmick. The point is just to say what is already possible, even with just that form of sideboarding. What we're going to get into now is all the really interesting, innovative ways that the Bazaar fiddles with the idea of a sideboard. And then there are even more beyond that. We haven't even talked about wish boards and like sideboarding, but not really like wish boarding in Commander, Magic the Gathering Commander, now a dominantly popular format. Just as a final point, I am kind of providing some canned advice for 10 minutes about how to enjoy sideboarding in Magic. I would strongly recommend that on the honor system should be fine if you play with nice people. You insist on having people start their deck with a committed set list like you would need to in a tournament, not like pre-sideboarded. I think a lot of strategies are much more interesting if you have to play them pre and post board. You have to make a judgment call about, what is the middle of the road version of this strategy. And I think a lot of the time it's the maximum greed version. You just make all the cards that commit heavily to your strategy and you just hope it works. And you have one game at the beginning where you just kind of hope for the best and you hope your strategy works out. And then you play, on average more games adapted to your opponent's strategy, making the concessions you feel are appropriate or sometimes not. Sometimes it doesn't make sense to. That, I think, makes it significantly more interesting. So, yeah, okay. There's a lot of different ways you can use the sideboard, even in a game that doesn't allow you to, play best of 3 and sideboard stuff in. You might be asking, what the heck does the sideboard do? Well, you can sideboard before fights, so one of the ways you can use it, just Rusty Begins, is to sideboard against NPC fights, which are the same every time. Every day you choose one of 3 monsters to fight, and I guess from experience you would know what they were. If the one with the best rewards is a bad matchup for what you have, it's sometimes advantageous to pack an item which fills in a weakness of your build. An example I've given here is the item Coolant, a small item which clears half your burn stacks, I guess, and freezes an opponent's item. It's not an efficient use of a slot unless you know an opponent is running burn, or you already have a build which relies on freeze synergy and you otherwise have no good solutions to a burn build. Lots of NPC enemies focus almost entirely on burn though, which makes this a great sideboarding option to take these fights. This is the closest to the conventional way a game uses a sideboard. Right, this is essentially sideboarding, but you're allowed to sideboard before the match, even though it's best of 1 and you know what your opponent is going to have. Sure. Another thing the stash can be used for is to keep items with off-board effects. I've included Globe as an example, which just gives you a flat amount of HP every day. The trade-off here is that you're trading sideboard space for scaling stats. And I have an example that will come up in a minute to show you quickly, the fishing rod. I don't totally understand here, but I believe that it says type there, aquatic, haste, and then there's a type tag called tool. I gather that this may mean it might just mean things that are literally tools for some kind of like all tool items. The more tool items you have, you get a bonus or something like that. But it kind of seems to me, looking at the other examples you posted, I showed this one because I feel like it sort of means it does something in your stash, or there might be no tag for that. I don't know. Anyway, it says the effect is it buffs an aquatic item that you have in play, but it also says at the start of each day, gain a small aquatic item. The way that this nomenclature, this is probably from the wiki, is described, it makes it a little unclear to someone who's never played this game before, but I believe that this means when it is in play, it buffs an aquatic item to the right of this for a certain amount of time. but then also just always get a small aquatic item. Maybe anything that refers to day or like time passing or matches passing or something. We'll say that. And so you can see here, there's like a sort of whole kit that can emerge out of this item. You can get it just to support an aquatic item you have, maybe a powerful shark or something. I don't know what's in this game, and you're buffing it with the fishing rod. That's a little weird from a lore perspective, but like okay, it buffs aquatic items. But also you can put it in your stash and use it to generate fish up, I suppose, aquatic stuff, presumably which you might have some luck buffing. It kind of creates its own little package. You can use it as already a part of an aquatic build that you have set up, or you can just use it for value. You could presumably sell the stuff that you fish up. So it can be played kind of three different ways. Having it be that this has an effect when not in your deck and when in your deck, as it were. It's kind of not a deck, I know. Is really interesting and means that the card has some flexibility. This sort of opens up the horizon for sideboarding and using the stash for new stuff. What if you use cards that are not in your main deck for something, but that something doesn't necessarily happen during play? It happens between play, for example. In Magic, the equivalent of this, or like best of three card games, would be maybe between rounds, stuff in your sideboard triggers. That you can imagine, something like that. Continuing, there are also items which you only want to play if you're confident you can win without using all of your board space, or you're confident you're going to lose if you're behind. Knee Brace is a small item you can play on board against another player if you think your build is currently behind curve and you think you're likely to lose anyway. For the space of one slot, it gives you extra permanent HP at the end of the fight, regardless of whether or not you win or lose. The idea here is that one of the focuses of Bazaar, I do know a tiny bit about this game, is you're going against a gauntlet of other players at a similar point in their roguelike-esque run through the game. And kind of a PvP Slay the Spire-esque thing. I'm relating everything to Slay the Spire. It's a Souls-like, after all. um, and so one of the really interesting focuses of the game is minimizing losses, basically, like making a judgment about losing. So this is where cards like this can come into play as well. If you have these items that have effects that are kind of greedy, you can decide when you want to use them. You could use them when you're way ahead, or you could use them when you're way behind, because what's the need to spend all your board space on stuff? You can just sneak it in. It's also a small item, so you could imagine if your board has like 7 slots and you have 4 medium-sized items you want to equip, well, that's 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2, 8 slots. You're going to equip 3 and then have 1 slot left over. Might as well put something in there. So if you're getting lots of small utility items, you could imagine how that could be very useful. Cool. There's also Wanted Poster, which has effects both on and off board for beating other players. In the Sash, it gives you a small amount of experience if you win a fight. On board, it gives only marginal benefit, but gives a very large amount of experience if you can win with the handicap. So you're ahead and you get a big payoff, right? There's also items which are similar but apply to NPC fights. There's an item called Boomerang, a weapon that gives you a free loot item, basically a consumable, if you win against a monster, but is otherwise very weak. Again, something you play when you're ahead and you can kind of call out. This is pretty interesting. Again, these effects give you this interesting dynamic that a lot of games don't have, where the game remains interesting when you are winning or losing by a lot. I think that's very smart, pretty interesting, and a thing that really speaks to the origins of the Bazaar. I know that this game was partly developed by people who are ex-professional competitive like card game players, significantly, and so these are people who've been frustrated by this stuff before. You can see them putting in things that I think a lot of developers would not think to put in, because it's a very player focusing thing to put in the game. It's something that thinks about how the player will feel as they play the game and doesn't, I think this is obvious to everybody, but it apparently isn't, like naively assume that just because the player is winning, that means everything is all good. It's not. It could be very boring, potentially. Or just because the player is losing, that means, like, just get it over with. No, you could make a game where it was still really interesting. I don't think this is a major thing in Magic the Gathering, for example, but you can just play the game out more, stall, not lose as quickly, as long as you have plenty of time left in your round to literally just see more of your opponent's deck. That can be very powerful in tournament Magic, depending on what your opponent's doing. And you can get a vibe for them. I've had players before where it's always obvious with these people, so it's not going to work that often, but like they got kind of frustrated that I wasn't giving up. I was a younger player at the time, and it was an older gentleman, and I guess they felt ageist, like, oh, you're some crappy kid who's wasting my time. You lost. Just surrender so we can go to the next round. And I just quietly said no as politely as I could and kept playing. And I ended up winning because I got more information about his strategy. He was just being callous. Like, that's obviously that is irrelevant. We're playing a win here. Like, just shut your mouth and let me see your cards. And that was a good experience. I like the idea that you sort of react to how the game is going a little bit, and you can choose to build in a certain way. A big focus in games like Magic the Gathering, and Hearthstone comes to mind, is tempo. The concept that there's a rhythm to how much value players are getting out of each turn of their time playing, or in this case, it would be like each day or each step in the run. And in Magic, often tempo is used as a way to think about how to kind of get in under your opponent. When do I want to play this threat? Well, maybe I'll give my opponent a hard turn and cash in some tempo, spend some cards that have an effect that slows my opponent down, but in the long run is not very sustainable, like returning things they've played to their hand. I didn't destroy their stuff, they just have to spend mana replaying it. And so next turn, they're going to be behind, but in 5 turns, I'm going to be behind because I just spent a bunch of cards to only slow them down temporarily. So what I want to do is play those and then seize the moment and play my aggressive thing they don't want to see right now because they're at a big tempo speed bump and kind of get in there. Do you see how that's maybe really similar to this? They kind of translated it into a different type of gameplay where you look at your strategies tempo in terms of the whole run and look at your roguelike playthrough. I don't exactly know what the Bazaar's like meta structure is, but imagine like you're playing Hades. Different parts of your run, your build is at different power levels, especially if you've kind of vaguely planned out what you want for your build. And you could look at that and potentially gain things from being aware of when the build is kind of hit a speed bump or, is cruising. You can gain value out of that in almost all roguelikes, really. But it's really interesting to make it a more explicit mechanic. That's really neat. There are also the next category of items, which are items which make more items and therefore need extra stash spaces, your sideboard space. Examples I've included of this are Cash Register, an item with no upside played on board, which creates 2 spare change at the end of each day. Fishing Rod, which I showed you, an item with situational benefit on board for items with a particular aquatic keyword, but then at the end of each day makes a small random aquatic item. And Money Tree, an item which creates a small change on level up and at the start of day, which can sometimes be and often are at the same time, which can mean the item needs even more stash space to avoid losing value, to not get you the most out of it. It also gains value when you sell a spare change, and when on board, heals equal to its value. This puts it in several categories. Early on in a run, you probably want Money Tree in your stash, taking up 3 slots, as it's probably not yet very good value on board for its space. However, in order to scale it, you need space in the stash to create the spare changes that later in the game, though, an item you're going to want on board because you'll get stats out of its stored value, or to synergize with other items which care about value as a keyword. Their sell price, I guess. Interesting. It's also an example of yet another category, items which when held conditionally gain value, which you can later sell to buy other items. An example of this I haven't taken a picture of is Cove, which gains 1 value each time you sell an item. So here we see a lot of examples of items in the fishing rod category that use your stash space for things in the run, but you're not intending to play these items directly primarily. They're kind of there accruing value, or that's at least not far from the only thing they do. And you're using your stash, your sideboard space, as a kind of a trade-off to just get value throughout the run. This category makes me a little bit worried about balance, which you did actually call out at the beginning of the parlay a little bit, because it seems to me that when the benefit of sideboarding things is so skill and knowledge dependent, you have to know when to swap things in, and like still conditional. You have to, like, for example, the things that give you value if you manage to win with the handicap of them in play, well, it's a big blowout if you don't. So you're not guaranteed value from them. And even then, the wanted poster makes me think, well, it's on the cusp of being a little win more, right? You're winning anyway, so you can trigger the value from it. But did you need something to propel you forward here instead of something that accumulates value over time? And then knee brace or like things like that. You think you're going to lose and you choose knee brace and you do lose and you get the bonus. You kind of made the best of losing. But what if you had invested resources in trying to win that fight instead? There is a sort of opportunity cost there. You might not have lost by that much. You get what I'm saying. On the other hand, using these items is pretty much guaranteed value. You don't really need to worry as much about, exactly when you swap them in or what the opportunity cost of waiting to swap them in was, like having it and then you're not getting any value unless the situation where it would be useful to swap in comes up. These, on the other hand, accrue value over time, and very much like a lot of things in many roguelikes that give you value over time, it's really good for modulating your run's tempo. You have a point where you're feeling a little weaker, a little stronger. You can make good use of these. You can sell your spare change items then. I don't know if that's how that works, but you get the idea. I feel, from a development perspective, things like this tend to be overpowered. Like it tends to be hard to balance the ability to do that with your stash space versus the mere benefit of maybe being able to swap something in for extra value. I don't know. I think a lot of games have that kind of thing where there's a knowledge checky thing you can benefit from, but a lot of the time, if you just don't and keep playing, you kind of already figured out how to get that value a different way by the time you would have put that together. That's not to say it can't be really fun. And again, maybe the items that we've talked about previously that you swap in are look really good. It's not like you couldn't balance this, possibly. I'm just saying I tend to feel the advantages are pretty huge because it's so adaptable. Like that can be very forgiving, and it has that elusive to balance quality where it can arguably require less player skill, and so it's hard to know exactly like where those values should be. I kind of want to play this game now. That sounds very interesting, but I'm also sort of concerned. I think I'm really glad you brought up this category. There are also, there's a lot of these items which don't do anything in the stash but pay off what's in the stash. Junkyard Lance does more damage the more individual items you have, both in stash and on board, which are small, I think it said, which means it specifically does well when you have a lot of small items, right? But locks out items from the previous category, which rely on having empty spaces because you're going to need all that space for small items, right? Finally, the stash is a useful tool for events in the game, with some requiring items such as Star Chart, an item with modest stats to enable crit and cooldown builds when used on board, but is mainly kept in stash as it unlocks extra options at a specific Work at Docks event. And certain items require an item with a specific keyword, so you might want a variety of keyword items in your stash. Events can also need a certain amount of free stash space to get value out of them. The event's Candy Stash and Eating Contest require you to have 3 or 5 free slots respectively to get the items to consume them to get full value out of the event, and are fairly common events. This means a build which has less than these number of slots doesn't get access to those events when they come up as a potential option. So here you can see yet another thing the sideboard is being used for. You're also sort of encouraged to not use it too much or to be precious about your slots. I really like this idea. This is a really good way to add opportunity cost to having the slots, occupied, because they are kind of, you start a run and the slots are kind of like superposition occupied at the beginning of play. If you've played the game a few times that the slots can be useful even if left empty. There's some benefit in theory, probably, you said fairly common events, to having the slots empty with nothing in them. And so when you add stuff to them, the first few things you might just store in there. And it sounds to me like about half of the stash space, like 5 slots or so, is relatively flexible. You can and will store stuff in there. There is no, you're not going to use the stash at all. It doesn't seem to me. But anytime you use more than that many spots, the game is gently saying, okay, like is never not some consequence to having those slots full, more or less, unless you've thought really far ahead. And that creates this nice pressure where you can use them. You're not out of slots. They're not making it demanding by giving you few slots. They're making it demanding by making it valuable to have a lot of them empty, but you can fill them. There are just consequences. That's a really interesting way to do it, rather than saying, oh, you just have very few slots. That makes these things less flexible. The exact number of slots can affect this a lot. I was talking before about how 60 card Magic the Gathering for tournaments, 15 card sideboard, and then Tiny Leaders, they've chosen to go with a 10 card sideboard, Tiny Leaders Reborn. 50 card deck, 10 card sideboard doesn't sound like that different. If you squint weird, it kind of sounds worse than 60 card deck, 15 card sideboard. And indeed, depending on how you hash out the math, you could argue that one or the other is more impactful. But I personally feel like the sideboarding in Tiny Leaders feels like way stronger. I have a transformative sideboard in one of my Tiny Leaders decks, so the sideboard is fully dedicated to making the deck into a different strategy, not to adapt to the opponent explicitly. I shifted into that different strategy to adapt to my opponent, but it's still my strategy I want to do. And I just think that this half of the deck, if you want to say it that way, which is partly stored in the sideboard, would be like a better matchup for this person. It contains some cards that are like pretty slow, so they would be really risky to play game one. But if I know my opponent's going to take a little time anyway, they're very strong. I'm just worried about getting bowled under. And so that they're in the sideboard. So it's still to adapt to the opponent, but the feeling of being able to swap out a third of your actively playable cards. I mean, in 60 card Magic, you've got maybe a 36 card deck and a 24 card, 24 lands, 36 like action cards, non lands, and then you're sideboarding 15. It is like more, I guess, of a percentage of your active cards, but the size of your deck being larger, and you're not often sideboarding in all 15 cards. And so my feeling has been that the impact of sideboarding in Tiny Leaders is noticeable and dramatic. Again, especially that singleton thing is like weirdly, I think, kind of good for sideboards. It sort of disfavors your main deck plan and doesn't do as much to your sideboard cards. So I just think it's really interesting. And the result is that you feel like there's this pressure to the size of your sideboard, but it's also not so small that you like can't do anything. You can change out a meaningful number of cards and put in some cards that are kind of for your strategy to flex around, not just concerned with your opponent. If there's counterplay stuff, you can quite easily devote like 5 sideboard slots to that. Not easily, but you can. And then you have it, and you will meaningfully often draw it. If you swap in 5 out of 15 cards in your deck, you have a pretty decent chance to draw one of them, while still playing a bunch of cards that are for your own devices. Anyway, I don't think, just Rusty concludes, I've seen sideboarding be pushed so hard as a mechanic in so many directions simultaneously before. It's Resident Evil 4 levels of revolutionizing an inventory. That's one way to put it. What lessons are there to take away from this, and which kinds of games can you think of that would benefit from the design space these ideas open up? Should games with formats that use sideboarding, like Magic the Gathering, be printing more cards that interact with the sideboard, even if it probably wouldn't happen with the current focus on Commander? How could we use the ideas this game has to offer to improve traditional roguelike deck builders, like Slay the Spire and Monster Train, to disrupt the card removal is always incredibly strong mechanic? Is that a mechanic that people would actually want disrupted? Well, people other than me, because the answer is yes. Emphatically, yes. Oh my goodness, please disrupt it any possible way. Certainly. I've done some of it as we go, but I have more to say and we'll conclude. So I do want to quickly note that a lot of the things in here are ways to use the space in a sideboard, but for things that don't have anything to do with sideboarding, like where sideboarding here means adapting to what is being played against you. I'd want to note that about like the better half of the things you mentioned are not actually sideboarding the adapting to the opponent thing. They're just playing with the board that is on the side. Like they concern a sideboard, but they're not the act of sideboarding. This doesn't necessarily matter. We talked about how that does put pressure on using the sideboard for sideboarding, but I raise the concern that a lot of the things that aren't sideboarding explicitly, but that use the sideboard space, sound kind of better than sideboarding. So I do think that's a concern. And playing a game where it is stronger to sideboard Magic, you can play some extremely powerful sideboard cards. I personally feel like that a game like Magic is a better candidate for adding stuff like that in because there's inherently a pretty high cost to sideboarding. There's a lot of benefit you can get from it quite easily if you devote all of it to just hating out other stuff. And so then you have to decide, if I can use that space for something else, what do I do? And it would create playstyles where you could make a deck that gained enough from doing its own thing with its sideboard that just sort of playing with its own strategy is the way to go. And you could make a deck that was more about adapting. Maybe the deck has a lot of throughput. It can cycle through its cards really quickly. I described my Grist, my bug deck, where I was getting the insect cards that just happened to be a lot of good sideboard cards. And because it mills itself, I often find what I'm looking for really quickly by dumping my whole deck into the graveyard. And so that deck is really fond of sideboarding. It's really good at being flexible and finding those cards. That being more of a choice the player makes would be fun. I think it's fair to say that in my own play, casually with my friends and folks, I am to some degree guilty of like cosplaying interesting sideboarding. It would probably be better if I put my mind to it to make a cutthroat tournament style sideboard. I just like in this particular context, I don't really see a point to doing that, but you see what I mean. And it would be really interesting game design to look at that and say, if we can align what the player might want to do, make a cool personal sideboard with what is good in the game, what the game rewards, that could lead to more fun. This is a great way to develop games. Look at a game you like, think about things that you feel like could be fun in the game, but which are just bad. And do they need to be bad? Is it an inherently uncompetitive strategy? Or do they just happen to be bad? Or there isn't support for that thing? Or there isn't a lot of that thing in the game? Make a game that has more of it. And I think to some extent that's what they already did here. So pretty cool. I'm very interested to fiddle with these sideboarding ideas myself. I will say that I think it being digital helps a lot. Just resetting your deck is kind of annoying, kind of a topic for another time. Should games with formats that use sideboarding like Magic be printing more cards that interact with the sideboard? They like kind of are, but asterisk. And we're pretty much just going to do the asterisk. Like, there are things like companions. These are sort of mini commanders. They'll say things like every card in your deck that's a creature has to have power above 3, and then you get to play an extra creature it technically by the rules in a space in your sideboard, but you get to just play them in the middle of a match. So you get kind of an extra card in your hand, I guess, for following a relatively strict, most of them are relatively strict, deck building restriction. Companions. These were a rules nightmare, but in theory a good idea. I just think they didn't, like, not to be blunt, but like didn't really think about it at all. Like, I don't know why the first version of companions was the way it was. It was just way, way too powerful in a way that I feel like was extremely obvious, and I think they only printed because they wanted it to be powerful, because they like jacking up the prices of their product by making something deliberately overpowered at the last minute and then realizing that it like completely destroys the game and then they nerf it. They've even admitted to doing this before in Magic the Gathering's case with Oko Thief of Crowns. If you play Magic and remember this card, in an interview they pretty much just straight up said, which I guess is good to their credit, that they purposefully made him stronger at the last second and knew they hadn't tested it because they wanted to push him as the face of the set, which means like we wanted it to make us more money, which I'm sure it did. And then he got banned everywhere because it's a stupid Magic card, and there you go. Yeah, putting that aside, that is terrible game design, and there's nothing more to say about Magic's game design. That is a thing they've briefly toyed with a little. There's also this mechanic in Magic that's really interesting to discuss here called the wish mechanic. This usually means it's not a keyworded mechanic, it's colloquial, and a lot of the cards say wish on them. That's the kind of flavor code for this. In the rules, it means take a card. Sometimes it needs to be a specific kind of card, like a sorcery or an artifact or this creature type of card or whatever, from outside the game and put it usually into your hand or like on top of your deck or something. In casual play, outside of the game means like go get it, your binder, I guess. But in tournaments, outside the game means from your sideboard. That's where this is going. Wish cards, in theory, allow you to play your sideboard cards during the game. They allow you to sideboard during the game for a mana cost, more or less, which it turns out is mostly bad in competitive play. Most of the wish effects are like just expensive enough that it really isn't worth the massive, massive tempo hit to be able to sideboard the card, especially because these cards do nothing when you don't have something you want to wish for. Again, pretty much all, not literally all, but almost all of the cards that allow you to do this, fetch something from your sideboard in the middle of play, don't do literally anything except that. So they can't even be played. You just don't draw a card unless you're willing to take the tempo hit. That's really bad. If you had a card in theory that let you take something from outside the game, but also had like a second mode you could choose that was like a reasonable spell, I believe that would be very, very strong. And indeed, some of the only wish spells I've seen played recently sometimes have been like Fae of Wishes. It's a creature that has this effect. So it's not like a great creature, but it's at least like a functional magic card if you don't want something from your sideboard. That's the point. You can see the pattern. The punishment is just too high for doing that. And to be fair, I have some sympathy. I think that they're worried that this would become, it could go from being totally unviable to being you would never not do this very quickly. And Magic just isn't really designed around that currently. It could become obnoxious very fast. However, there is a way to play Magic where it is a fantastic idea to allow and use wishes, and they are not too weak because you have a lot of mana in this format usually, and they're also not too strong because you have three other opponents and it's Commander. Commander, rules as written, does not have sideboards, which means it does not have wishes. If you treat a wish as meaning you get a card from outside the game, which means your sideboard. By the letter of the law, you can't wish in Commander. Now, Commander is often considered a casual format, and so, like, why not? And I'm sure plenty of groups would allow it. I want to recommend explicitly allowing it, saying you need to have a wish board, you need to have a sideboard that you can only use for wishes because you don't sideboard in Commander. You need to set aside the list, the limited list of cards that you will pull from, but you can use wishes. You explicitly can. We're not saying it's a casual format, we're just saying you can. The rules are arbitrary, and Wizards of the Coast is bad at game design. Sorry, they weren't, but now they are, in my opinion. They just don't care anymore, and it's been sold out. So, too bad. We're going to do it ourselves. Let's allow wishes. I do this. We do this, really, in my pot of Commander decks that mostly I've been managing, but we play with my friend group. And it's really, really fun. Having it be that you can basically buff some strategies by allowing effects that pull from your wish board allows you to make some strategies more flexible. And then we don't give every deck a wish board. It's usually something I've done because the deck needed a little help. For example, the mono red deck in our pod. Mono red is, for my money, by far the worst, no contest, single color to play in Commander. It's surprisingly not bad, but hilariously worse than pretty much everything else. Red just has the narrowest tools by a long shot, and the tools it does have are the worst in Commander, I think, at their weakest in Commander, for the most part, anyway. So, having it be that the red deck can play, I think it's like 7 cards, that just let it pick the perfect thing from outside the game has been a significant step up for that strategy. It can often afford it. Red is good at making a big burst of mana. So you can play like 2 or 3 cards and then suddenly, you have the perfect answer to the situation. And the deck really needs that. So that's been very, very interesting. Um, the other half of this, though, is that more cards that did stuff like that is a pretty obvious design area to pull from. One thing I would like to see is something like a card can sort of yoink something from your sideboard. Maybe you tuck it under the card, and then when the card is killed or destroyed or whatever, that card goes to your hand or something like that. Maybe it needs to be in a way like on a timer. If the card survives for a turn, then you get the card. So it lets you sideboard, but in a way your opponent can interact with, I guess is what I'm trying to do. It being when it dies is a bad idea because you just sacrifice it or kill it yourself to get your card. It wants to be something where you're allowed to basically play a card that says, I attempt to sideboard in the middle of gameplay. And then your opponent can go, you have this other good creature, maybe I'll kill that instead. But that is your sideboard totem or whatever, I don't know. And if I don't kill that this turn, then you get to sideboard. And your opponent can go, I'm gonna choose to do this. And then it's sort of a back and forth part of the game. That seems like a fairly straightforward way to do it, that Magic with its current rules could like maybe withstand. Without it just being utterly broken and without it always being a good idea. It would mostly be a problem for like really fast and really slow decks where it probably isn't worth the risk of them just destroying it every time or slowing down your offense. Presumably, this card isn't that powerful by itself. But then mid-rangey decks that are already seeking to play value stuff and kind of adapt in the middle turns of the game would probably love this kind of thing, but there is still lots of counterplay. And even if your opponent doesn't bring a lot of removal, your opponent's playing aggro, you play one of these, they attack a bunch of stuff into you, you are now considering blocking, let's say it's a creature. But you have to get it to survive till next turn to do your sideboarding thing. So now you have to choose. Even though your opponent doesn't have removal, they're putting on enough pressure that you might die. I think it's best for these to be creatures, something easy to kill that there's lots of removal available and that might die to combat, something like that. So, yeah, it would be cool to see something like that. I want to finish the parlay though on the foreboding note that you gave with like disrupting the card removal is always incredibly strong mechanic. I'm gonna read what you said again. How could we use the ideas this game has to offer, the Bazaar, to improve traditional roguelike deck builders like Slay the Spire and Monster Train to disrupt the card removal is always incredibly strong mechanic? So what you mean is that in Slay the Spire, for example, you initially start out by wanting to take lots of cards at the beginning of your run. But a lot of players quickly realize that if you could control what was in your deck, you could pretty much draw the same hand every time, and this would be a very powerful combo tool. So they begin pursuing every possible way to remove cards from your deck, and will pay a lot and take risks to be able to remove cards or not take cards. And events that force you to take cards can be surprisingly bad, rather than just being allowed to buy cards. When you go to a shop and Slay the Spire, it's good because you can pay money to remove a card from your deck, and because you can add cards to your deck by paying for them, but you can also not add cards to your deck. You can look at what's there and say, I'm not going to add anything to my deck, and there's no consequence for doing that. You can just, well, there's a benefit. You save money, which you can spend to remove cards from your deck. It's very good. And this is to say core mechanic of Slay the Spire is an understatement. As a detractor of Slay the Spire, I feel this is essentially the only thing that matters in the entire game. If you do that well, like that's it. That is the game. That's not even necessarily a dig. That can be interesting in its own way. I like how it works in Inscription, where you do have lots of ways to minimize cards, but you're meant to figure out how to make the best of them. To do that in an advantageous way. So it becomes much more interesting to remove cards because a lot of the ways that you can remove cards in Inscription have a chance or also make one of the involved cards stronger, which encourages you to remove stronger cards or to remove cards that are weak in your deck currently but have redeeming qualities. And this encourages the developer to have the game be full of things that are like weak overall, but they do have some benefits, and it makes the game overall just, I think, much more interesting. It acknowledges that if you know how these games work, you're not considering whether to remove a card. You should essentially always be removing a card. That's not an actual decision point, so the developer had the foresight to make it so there is still a decision point. And another way that you could do that would be to make it that you can swap cards out of your deck. I've seen a variety of approaches. In Chrono Arc, for example, you can always delete cards from your deck for free down to the minimum, but the minimum is high, like 5 or 6 cards per character, and you have 4 characters. And so if you have 8 cards from one character, you can delete 3 of them for free, but you can't ever delete like more than that. And there are some cards that, when played, don't show up again for the rest of that fight. This allows you to potentially make your deck smaller, but you also might want that effect more than once per fight. So there's a trade off. That's one way you could do it. And another obvious way you could do it is to simply like be able to take stuff out and put it back in, to have a sideboard be there. It would be interesting to see something like some fights allow you different deck or board sizes than other fights. That is, it sounds like in the Bazaar, it basically just grows, your board grows. It would be interesting to have some fights that are small and some fights that are big. A game recently that has something vaguely related to this that I'm really interested in is called, oh no, Gambonanza. Final answer, Gambonanza. Gambonanza is what it's called. Gambonanza. That's fun, isn't it? Free shout out to Gambonanza. This is basically Balatro, but for chess. And the thing I think is really interesting about it is that they have taken advantage of how chess can be, if you've played variants of chess where you don't start the pieces in the normal positions, you know how it can be surprisingly interesting to like not have the pieces be in normal positions. What's that variant called? Chess 128, or there's some number that is basically just the back pieces are shuffled to an extent. So your, non-pawns get their positions shuffled, which makes it so you can't just memorize openings and stuff. And that's kind of reductive about chess, but it's not completely reductive. That kind of is how chess is. That thing. The interesting thing about Gambonanza to me is that it's embracing different board sizes when you play your chess interactions. You get different pieces and you can deploy them a little bit like shogi if you've played that, and if you haven't, go play some shogi. That's a fun variant. Not really a variant of chess, but chess like shogi, where you can drop pieces that you've captured back onto the board. There's this kind of attrition thing going on with shogi that is kind of interesting, or stalemate, like anti-attrition. And it has some of that, but the chess boards that you're playing are very different in size. And obviously this makes certain pieces better and worse than others. Pawns get much stronger if the board is a certain size and shape, long and not very wide, basically. And some pieces get a lot worse if the board is that shape. Bishops, for example, are not very good if the board is not square, like rectangular instead of square. Long but not as wide, or wide and not as long, because diagonals don't go as far, right? Rooks can be powerful in a different way depending on the shape of the board. You get it. And so it's really interesting to look at a game like that and see how, I don't know exactly how this works because the game isn't out yet, but if you had certain chess pieces in reserve, deploying different combinations of them would be really fun and a really meaningful decision as you sort of build out a squad, and you can imagine based on what your opponent or the NPC has. So I do think there are a lot of ways that just having some things in reserve, or even having a mechanic as simple as when you remove a card from your deck, it goes in your sideboard for now and then comes back like the next fight after this or something. You kind of boomerang cards or rebound cards in and out of your sideboard, something like that. So I think the main thing that interests me is having it be a place where that stuff is stored. I admit I am not as keen on the focus on getting value out of your sideboard space. I think that is a better supplemental effect, and I want to really prioritize making a system that makes it good to sideboard, to be sideboarding, not just to have a sideboard that is giving you value. And instead, I would rather make those things that accrue value over time on the weak side. I don't know, maybe that is already how it is in the Bazaar, but personally, I want that because it creates opportunity cost. Your sideboard space is worth something, but I also don't want that because it makes it very easy to become better to just use your sideboard for value and not to like actually sideboard, which, while fine, it's like, okay, well then just don't put sideboarding in the game. I want it to be that the game rewards sideboarding and that is dynamic in an interesting way. One more thing before I go. Developers, if you're listening and you are going to make a game like this, as I am now very keen to do myself, I have a request. This results in the player changing the list of their deck or their board or whatever very often. Please try hard to include the feature that the player can save a deck list, a loadout, the state of their board, so that when they swap it back and forth or whatever, that isn't a really tedious process. There are many games where it is really good to adapt the gear you have equipped, even games that aren't anything like this. Elden Ring comes to mind, where because there is no system to save loadouts, it's extremely annoying to swap things back and forth. But like it would be really good and a huge part of the game if it just wasn't really annoying to do that. It arguably is still a big part of the game. It's still rewarding enough to do that you like people do it still. But I really feel like that is a core feature for those games, but it's really underrepresented. Like a lot of games don't have this, even though it's almost inconceivable that you would play the game without using it. And so, like, I kind of get it. For some games, it might feel a little bit like on the periphery of what people would actually use. Maybe Elden Ring felt that way to the developers. I don't think it's very optional. I think it's something you would not likely play the game without using a little bit, but I'm sure people do. But what if it was in the game? Whereas some games like this, it's like the game is designed around you constantly switching out and then switching back in your stuff. So having a few ways to quickly save loadouts or whatever makes a gigantic difference. I believe a significant part, as I said earlier in the parlay, of the reason why people don't sideboard in Magic is literally just because it's annoying and they feel like they're playing a casual game, which doesn't fit with more work and like slightly more sweat, their deck at their most powerful. But sideboarding can just be way more fun. It doesn't have to be about strict competition. It can just be, it's a way you react to your opponent and respect and are interested in their strategy. But it comes at the cost of some tedium, and minimizing that tedium has a real effect on gameplay. If the game is the behavior the game rewards, part of rewarding behavior is not just making it good in the game, it's making it easy in the game because you don't have to play the dang video game. Like you can just go do something else. So anyway, just please consider loadouts when this type of mechanic is in your game. Okay, good talk. Uh I think that's mostly what I have to say. Is it a mechanic people would actually want disrupted? No, I don't think so. I think this is kind of a separate parlay. I will talk about it for a minute or two. Do people want more sideboarding or like want card removal in deck builders is strong to be disrupted? The answer is no, in my emphatic opinion. I really want it to be disrupted, but I think for a lot of people, these games seem complex from the outside, and they like that there is a simple thing that you can keep as your guiding compass North Star to do. If you reduce the size of your deck and you pick only cards that are really good for your strategy, you tend to be on the right track. I think that people think they want that. The task then would be to make a series of games that shows people the fun of it not being that simple, and then gives them a ramp where they can enjoy the basic level of these types of games, and then move on to it being a little bit more complicated than just make your deck small. Like that is boring eventually, but I don't think it's bad that people want to get in the door. And it's important to remember that these games have been very popular where different roguelike deck builders have not been. That is partly luck, but is also partly because of how they're designed. Evidently, people want something about that. And I think it's more productive to think about how you could introduce people to the fun of it not being like that. Not to say, oh, like, but that's what people want, so just do it. Like, definitely not. But at the same time, I don't think you should just ignore people either. There's a middle ground. Yeah, but I do kind of think that's a separate topic. How do you make like get a mechanic to that public understanding where people want to use it in this way or that way is like a whole other thing. I feel like we covered this pretty thoroughly, but there would still be a lot more to talk about that, in my opinion. Really, really interesting parlay that went significantly over, but it was also very long. This was like on the borderline of how long a parlay's text can be, but I thought it was really cool, and I made you wait a long time, so I wanted to do a long one on it. Folks, if you want to get your own parlay like this one, they will tend to be a little shorter, but, forgive me. You can do that using a link in the description. We'd love to have you. You can submit whatever you want. Looking forward to the next one.